wish I could say that it was for the best, without a throbbing coming from my chest. Knowing what's next makes it much harder, apart from believing that this couldn't end. No more.
Hello and welcome to Good Vibes with Kevin and Aaron. We're your hosts, Aaron
And Kevin.
Hey, my guy. And today we're going to be reviewing the new XXXTentacion album, 17. How were you exposed to XXXTentacion? What's your experience listening to him prior to this album?
So, I never went out of my way to look for an X song, ever, actually, before this album. I've heard him on Ski Mask, the Slump God features, and, when Ski Mask is featured on his songs, I've heard those. And, my friends have played some X songs, but, Look at Me. That was, basically the first thing I heard.
No, it was pretty much the same for me. First thing I heard was Look at Me. And the reason I heard about Look at Me was because Drake had allegedly ripped his flow from Look at Me for the song KMD, which was on More Life. What's been your feel on XXXTentacion as far as an artist? I mean, he's been stirring up a lot of controversy.
Yes. Personally, I never viewed him as somebody I would go out of my way to listen to ever. Just because of what he's known for and all the allegations that he's a part of, I'm not really one to go look for somebody of that nature.
Yeah. And just to be clear for the viewers on the allegations, he has been arrested multiple times. He spent some time in jail. One big allegation being that he allegedly assaulted and verbally abused his ex-girlfriend, who was possibly pregnant at the time of the assault. And some parole violations, just some really nasty things to say in interviews about other artists, about kind of a lot of things in general. He just he's been making an image for himself that to me, I haven't been a very big fan of X. I haven't been a big fan of his music. I've kind of strayed away from his public persona, but I respect kind of what he's trying to do with the music. I like the sort of gritty aspect of it.
Yeah.
And as a celebrity, I feel like he's kind of fulfilling this role that punk artists have been fulfilling since the 70s, He's kind of going on interviews and he's being crass and he's being disrespectful in a way that I haven't seen since old punk musicians have been going on interviews and basically saying that, like when Johnny Rotten went on an interview and they were like, what kind of influence do you guys, the Sex Pistols, have? And he basically said, we don't have influences. It's all a sham. There's no point in drawing from other artists. We just do our own thing and that's it, And I feel like in a lot of ways that's X, Going into this album, did you have any expectations of what it was going to sound like?
I thought it was going to be a lot of distortion and yelling and screaming from what I've heard before. I thought it was going to be mostly that. And I tried to set zero bias when I listened to it. But when I heard the first audio clip of him talking, he gave me an expectation I'm supposed to set. So that's how I went into the album viewing it as.
That's fair. Yeah, I went into this expecting the old X that I had been familiar with, and it's not at all what I got. Not at all. What was your first impression of the album?
So, my initial reaction to the album, my first listen through, was mostly shock. I got basically zero bangers and no distortion, which I was waiting for. And there was basically one song with consistent sub bass. And it's still a singing track like the rest.
Yeah.
I found the beginning vocal clip to be uncomfortable and kind of demanding. He says like listen to it this way and doesn't let the listeners listen to it in their own way.
Yeah.
Which kind of constricts like the possibility for personal interpretation.
Yeah, he basically does lay down an expectation with the album. I mean, he says like, these are my thoughts, these are my feelings. If you don't like it, don't listen.
Right.
You know? And then he says, this album is made to alleviate or numb depression. Right there, he's stating a sort of not only a mission statement for the album, but a usage for the album. Like he's saying, this album is for this purpose and nothing else. You know.
What about you? What was your initial reaction the first listen to?
Honestly, I was blown away the first time I heard this. I have never heard a rap album that's this dreary, this melancholic.
Yeah.
Just, I mean, the whole thing just drips with depression.
It does.
And when I heard the first track, when he's like, you know, 17's the number tattoo on the side of my head, I thought it was kind of melodramatic. I was like, it just seemed like almost like a Gerard Way, like almost like a My Chemical Romance move, you know.
Yeah.
It seemed like I was about to delve into this like really emo flavored album that took itself really seriously and really was melodramatic. And honestly, that's kind of what it is. It's almost like a modern rap equivalent of an emo album from the early 2000s or even the late 90s. I was hearing a lot of Dashboard Confessional in this. I was hearing some Linkin Park influence maybe, you know.
Okay.
I read online that he's a big Kurt Cobain fan. I was hearing that. So when I first listened to it, I was really polarized by all the different alternative and emo influences going into it. That being said, did how you feel about this album change the more you listened to it?
Yeah, actually it did. The first listen through was kind of like, all right, it's all kind of like one long song and it all kind of sounds the same.
I felt the exact same way.
I was trying to like break down like how he was going to go about curing my depression. At the same time, I never expected that to happen. I was just the most curious as to see how he was going to go about that.
Mm-hmm.
And from what I heard as a theory I created, his attempt at curing or numbing depression is like projecting his problems onto you.
Mm-hmm.
Because aside from the song Carry On, it seems there is like no solution he's trying to give.
Definitely. Yeah.
And he wanted to like list problems that he personally has so that people that can relate understand someone else is going through something similar.
Mm-hmm.
I understand how that could create connectivity, but not how it's supposed to help.
Yeah.
It's just like herding a bunch of sad people to listen to the same music. Mm-hmm. It's a good marketing tactic, but not a therapy strategy.
Yeah. I mean, as far as the depressive front on this album, when I listened to this album, the thing that really struck me the third time I listened to it, which was the time that I listened to it with the lyrics in front of me, it struck me that I've had clinical depression for since I was a teenager. You know, I still struggle with clinical depression, and it struck me that at some point in my life I thought every single thing that X says on the album.
Right.
Every single lyric has run through my mind at some point, and listening to the album, it didn't bring me back to a depressive state, you know, but it did make me really sad, and it made me think about when I was in a much more depressive state, and it was almost comforting because I felt like X sort of understood what it was like to be in that position, and like I didn't feel like the album was him saying, I'm depressed, if you're depressed, that's cool. I felt like it was him saying, I'm depressed, I know you're depressed, I get it, you know, I get what you're going through. And that sort of comforted me, and also the album reminded me of a much worse place in my life, and I felt like grateful that I was here in a much better state after having listened to the album.
Oh, Now, do you think like the average X listener is going to listen to it and think, oh, I remember when it was bad, or do you think they're gonna dwell in what is already bad?
You know, I think the average X listener is probably in that state still.
Yeah.
And this album to me serves the same function that an album like Pornography by The Cure served when I was listening to it in high school. Because that's still one of my favorite albums. And in high school, it was my favorite album. But it's a incredibly dreary album, very depressed, very hopeless, very cynical, very nihilistic. There's no hope in the album. But listening to that album in high school when I didn't have hope, in a way it almost kind of gave me hope, not in a real universal sense, but in that I felt like I was being understood by the music and that the music was sort of a place where my feelings could dwell. You know?
Okay.
I almost felt like Pornography in high school was my safe place. And I feel like this might serve the same function for people who are clinically depressed in high school now.
I can tell just by the way he presents himself on the internet and through music, he's like an extremely conflicted person.
Definitely.
And he like tries to wear all of these hats, and I don't know if any of them even fit because he spreads himself so thin.
I've seen his confliction. I've seen that he has a lot of different faces to him, and it reminds me a lot of myself in high school, you know. It reminds me of wanting to be a certain thing, but not feeling like I could achieve that certain thing, so constantly going back and forth between these different personas and different motivations, you know. I mean, there were times in high school where I just really wanted people to like me, but I also really wanted to prove to people that I didn't need them. And I was very resentful, and I would push people away. It was all rooting from this sense of wanting to, I don't know, express these really complicated emotions that I didn't know how to express, and they would lead me into bad things. And I think X is kind of the same way.
How do you feel about like, as far as like the actual songs without like an expectation about without like what he says, like,
yeah,
what do you think they sound like?
Well, okay, so I think there's two ways to approach this album. Okay, I think the first way is you approach it as though it's a music album, you know, it like you would approach any other album. And I don't really think it holds up as a music album. I think the songs are way too short. I mean, they almost sound unfinished. They sound kind of like demos. Because there will be chorus, one verse, chorus, done, you know, if that. And I think the album is way too short. It's barely an album. I mean, it's basically an EP. It's 11 tracks, the 11th being the intro.
Right.
And, I mean, none of the tracks break the 3-minute mark.
You're right.
And as far as the sound of it, it's pretty melodramatic. It's pretty over the top. The songs themselves, you know, they're not very deep. They're not very poetic. The lyrics are, I mean, it's pretty standard run-of-the-mill, like depressive, almost emo flavored lyrics. That being said, the second way to go into it, which is the way that I enjoy this album, is as an experience, you know. You put the album on and you listen to the whole thing front and back, and you don't pick apart every song, you don't pick apart every lyric. You ingest it as a whole thing, as one, you know, coherent listen. And I think the shortness of the album is enhanced by that perspective, because it's not a really long, really drudging listen. It goes by fairly quickly. And I think the length of the songs is enhanced by that, because you're not listening to it as singular songs, but you're listening to it as one full thing. And I think some of the amateur production also enhances the feeling of gloom, the feeling of depression, this feeling of isolation. So as far as listening to it as an experience, I love the album. I think it's absolutely brilliant. I love the emotion. I love the atmosphere. But as an album that you might break down, you know, in a musical sense, from a critical standpoint, I'm torn. Like, I don't like the album critically.
Right.
Critically, I think this album is really lacking.
Yeah, I feel you there. I feel like the album from a musical point of view is like, yeah, like what you said, almost unfinished, kind of like thrown together in a way.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like there was so, like, he took it so seriously and like basically gave you half a meal, and and like you're supposed to like be anticipating something, and it's over in 20 minutes.
Yeah. Do you hear this album in the same experiential way that I was describing, or can you not really get yourself in that mindset?
Oh, personally, like, I think the sounds of the album and like the songs like are good. Like, it only sounds good in a whole.
Yeah.
And like I think that it's like a calm, mellow feeling that's not like warm, but like it's comforting almost. And like it's definitely a bold move for X for him.
Definitely.
I like a whole, like, I think it's his first album technically.
Yeah, his first full-length studio album.
And it's not what anybody knows him for. I think that's a bold move.
Yeah. I definitely think it was brave of him to do this project and to completely subvert people's expectations.
I can't help but like the general sound of the album. Like I said, it's a calm, mellow feeling, but with that, like a cold ice pick gouges my spine with the weight of depression.
Yeah.
And like the idea that nobody's ever going to forgive this person for their atrocious actions. Of course, nobody was there and really knows the entire situation except him and those involved. But he still wears a sign around his neck that says, I supposedly beat my girlfriend and went to jail for it.
Yeah.
With that in mind, he has a song called Carry On, explaining that with all he's done and been through, even he has to keep moving on, and because that is all that he can do.
So if you could suggest one track off of this album that somebody listened to as sort of an introduction to the album, what would you pick?
I would choose the song Carry On because it seems like that was like the only solution that he gives in his whole album.
Yeah.
With the expectation he creates. So I would definitely recommend that one because that was like the one thing that I seemed was going towards the direction.
Okay. I would definitely recommend Jocelyn Flores. I feel like that's the real heart and soul of the album and what the album's trying to do. I think kind of the whole vibe of the album is wrapped into that one song. This really depressive, suicidal, just this scourge into depression, you know?
Okay, so I got a couple questions for you.
All right.
I'm going to switch it up, though.
Okay.
So, would you ever, after this, listen to the album?
I don't know, honestly. I've been thinking about that. If I was depressed, I'd definitely listen to this album. I think this could become my go-to depressed rap album, which used to be Earl Sweatshirt's I Don't Go Outside.
There you go.
But this might actually replace I Don't Go Outside just because this one's so much more depressing and so much heavier.
Okay. And did the album cure or numb any of your depression? Or did it bring you depression?
It's really hard to say, you know, because it's like there's dimensions to it, you know. It's like in a way, it did bring back a feeling of depression. It did bring me. It's a very sad album, and it's a very melancholic listen. But I mean, I think it's just depressive in a different way. It's almost therapeutic in its depressiveness. I mean, it's the same way that I would listen to The Cure or Typo Negative in high school. It's a lot like A Crow Looked at Me by Mount Erie, right? Which is this extremely depressive, extremely nihilistic folk album about the singer's wife dying of cancer, you know. And when I listened to that album, I sobbed for the entirety of the album. But after I'm done listening to that album, I feel like I've kind of peeked into the subject in a way that I haven't been able to acknowledge on my own, or haven't found a way to acknowledge on my own. And I feel like this weight is lifted. And whereas that album's about death, I feel like X's album here is kind of the same thing, but with depression and suicidal thoughts. It's taking this really dark glimpse into this subject matter and then feeling this alleviation afterwards. I got a couple questions for you. First off, X said in an interview that in order to understand his music, you have to be or have been at one point depressed. Do you think that holds true?
Yes, it holds true because I feel like most of his music, especially in this album, is going towards relating with him and his depression and like what he's going through. So yes, that is true what he said, but it's kind of a universal statement because most people I can vouch for, I feel, have been or deal with a slight form of depression.
Okay, I got you. And then my second question is, do you think that X is forerunning a new wave of hip-hop that celebrates or revels in depression and vulnerability rather than an older wave of hip-hop which was more focused on being upbeat and being masculine?
I feel like he's on the front line of that wave, and he's definitely normalizing that type of behavior in music. I feel like he's most certainly a part of it, maybe the leader of it, but I like the vulnerability aspect of the wave, like showing yourself, like letting people know about you. But I don't like the negative energy that it brings with it, and I would rather it have been the other way around. Right. That being said, like, you can't have one without the other.
All right. And last thing, would you recommend this album?
I would recommend this album because it is a different look at the monster known as XXXTentacion.
I agree with that, and I would also say look at this album because it's a completely new take on rap music, and it's introducing an element of rap that we haven't seen before, and I think that in itself is just a very exciting thing. That being said, I would recommend it, but I wouldn't expect the person I recommend it to like it.
Fair.
All right, so this was Good Vibes with Kevin and Aaron. Thank you for watching. You can subscribe to us on YouTube, check us out on Facebook, all the social media. And as Confucius once said, the vibe is only right if the right side of the vibe is right. Stay chillin'.
Stay tuned for Action Bronson 7000 review. Oh, peace.
You got me stuck like nicotine.